Welcome to episode 69 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's October 2025. We made it. So, otsukaresama deshita. A couple of business points at the top of the pod. First, we have survived the summer. The last true 30-degree day, I think, was last month on the day I recorded, so end of September. I'm recording a little early this month, but the weather has been mostly pretty pleasant here in Osaka. I wouldn't say cool, but there were hints of future fall weather in the mornings, and it looks like next weekend might be the first legitimately crispy weekend of the season here in Osaka. The first below about 10 degrees Celsius. The second point is that I'll be taking the podcast off Spotify at the end of the month. So if you listen there, please do find an alternative way to listen, because I'll be removing it at some point in November. And I reserve the right to need more time to do so because I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I rarely log into my Spotify back end to see what's going on, but I'm going to have to try and do that and figure out what's up. But yeah, please do find another spot to listen. It's basically everywhere else. And on to the content this month. I have, at the end of the podcast, I have one of my favorite recommendations, and that is Shin Osaka Station. This isn't a recommendation per se, but this is kind of my abbreviated guide to Shin Osaka Station, inspired by recently passing through and seeing a kind of horrible tourist blockade, but not just tourists, there were tons of Japanese as well, and massive lines that I think can mostly be avoided if you know one little secret. Also, I've kind of come to appreciate and understand Shin Osaka Station in a way that I think can be helpful. So stay tuned for that. If you ever pass through Osaka, I think that'll be helpful. But first, this month in the newsletter, I wrote about one of the funnier words in the Japanese language and a line that you can use to get a laugh. And I revisit a nice conjunction that I wrote about previously that also has a lot of nice ways you can use humorously. I wrote about Japanese humor previously in the Japan Times, and actually I wrote about it twice. I realized as I was looking back, and I wrote about them both in July. The first time was July 2011, and I wrote about a bunch of different phrases I guess I had kind of collected in my mind at that point. And the first was saying moshi moshi. Moshi moshi is a way you can kind of get someone's attention if they're not paying attention. Obviously, it's what you say when you pick up the phone in Japan. But if somebody's kind of dozed off, you can say moshi mosh and kind of try and get their attention the way you do in English when you say something like Earth to Ted, come in Ted, if someone's not paying attention. I also included the phrase komento hikae sasete itadakimasu. Komento hikae sasete itadakimasu, which is basically a polite way to say no comment in Japanese, and it's a kind of funny phrase that you can use to provide further information, or rather to avoid providing further information and then letting people's imagination kind of fill in the blanks. We do the same in English by pleading the fifth, or even just saying no comment. And the other funny phrases that I use are two others that I introduced in that first article. The first was inochi ni kakawarimasu. Inochi ni kakawarimasu, which is a phrase that means you'll put your life at risk. It's funny to suggest something that isn't deadly might be deadly. And that's a way to suggest that you're putting yourself in that danger. And then the last phrase that I said, introduced in that article, was yoku iwarimasu. Yoku iwarimasu, which is a phrase that just means people say that about me all the time. And it's funny to kind of just, if somebody says something funny or weird about you or strange, then you can just say, oh, I get that all the time. Yoku iwarimasu. So then, strangely, 10 years later, in July 2021, I wrote another column about Japanese humor, and this one was more general rather than specifics. I found this article online on this website called Omokoro that did a kind of internet survey of several hundred people. I'm sure it was extremely not scientific, looking into what was the funniest Japanese word. And even if it wasn't Nothing in there like was super convincing. Like, okay, yeah, this is the funniest Japanese word, at least in my opinion. There were some interesting patterns. And the first was that the plosive words, the pagyo, papi pupepo, are funnier than other kind of sounds in the language. And some of the words that they use that use the pagyo sounds are pineapple, panti, and upi goldbag. And as you can tell from those three, the foreign words also kind of stood out to Japanese people as, or at least the Japanese people who answered this survey, as funnier than others. And the other foreign words included that weren't pagyo were words like crouton and mojito. So maybe it's not a surprise that words that are kind of like notably different or notably foreign are somewhat inherently funny, I guess. But interesting to kind of have that confirmed, and also to have the confirmation that the pagyo sounds are kind of uniquely funny. And there were also some other funny non foreign words, such as ipponguso, a long strand of poop, which also takes advantage of that pagyo, and keimukujara, covered in hair. And then the one other interesting thing from that article was that they noted words that have a gap between the meaning and the sound. The one that stood out for me there was bohyo, which is a gravestone marker, and pretty clearly bohyo like sounds like something different than a gravestone marker, or maybe more like something like an animated spring launching a small animal into a field or something like that. But yeah, so those are the two kind of like takes on Japanese humor that I've written about so far. And then this month I wrote about the word nuzzle, which I was reminded of specifically because of a viral video from the 2000s. Don't remember exactly how I saw this video, but I am fairly certain it was on YouTube, which I think seems to clock because of some internet sleuthing I did. YouTube came out in 2005, which was the year I started on Jet. And by the time I finished in 2008, it was a bit more of a cultural force, and little viral moments were starting to pop up. These were like early days meme stuff. I mean, there were probably memes since before that, but these were kind of like those. I guess those were limited to things like movies that you had to download, or um, online animation like Homestar Runner and things like that. When YouTube got going, I guess that was really when these short viral videos first started up. That's when Maru the cat, the online internet cat, first got going right around that time. He actually just died, sadly enough, but he was really one of the greats. But one of the videos I think that popped up around that time was a comedic skit about sushi. That's titled "The Japanese Tradition, Nihon no Katachi." And at the time, I had no idea it was a kind of series of short videos that had come out a few years earlier. And one of them had been submitted to the Berlin International Film Festival. The one that was submitted to the festival was about bowing, and it was extremely short, really just like a couple of minutes. I don't think any longer than that, maybe even less than that. The sushi skit's a bit longer, and it's very funny. I was living with Japanese roommates at the time, and I remember going out for drinks when my brothers came to visit Japan, and I'd just seen the skit, and so the part about pouring beer for somebody really kind of stuck out in my mind. The two main characters in the skit kind of fight over who gets to pour first, and then the person who pours encourages the drinker by saying "ma ma 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 ma" as they fill the glass, and then the person who accepts the beer says "otto to 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 to." And so when we were out with my Japanese roommates, they thought it was really one of the funniest things that they had ever heard when I started like showing my brothers, okay, this is what you do when you pour each other beer in Japan. And then they laughed even harder when I showed them the video when we got back to our share house. So I think it's safe to say that the video is satirical. There's some over the top stuff in it along the way, but it does hit on some universalities like this mama mama otototo. And one of the aspects of the language specifically that I like kind of identified as, okay, this is funny when I was watching it, was their use of nuzzle. And they use it twice in this video. First, when they introduce pickled ginger, which is served alongside sushi, as everybody knows, and is called gari in Japanese. They say it this way. これはガリです。材料は謎です。これはガリです。材料は謎です。This is gari. The ingredients are a mystery. And this is funny because it couldn't really be farther from the truth. We know exactly what gari is, but it's funny to pretend that it's something mysterious or maybe like lead people on to suggest that it's something that it isn't. And then later in the skit, they go on to kind of subvert this with an example that's maybe actually kind of mysterious. And that one is a little bit longer. And this is what it sounds like. It says, これは領収書という不思議な紙です。これを書いてもらえば、後から換金することができます。仕組みは謎です。Let me read that one more time. これは領収書という不思議な紙です。これを書いてもらえば、後から換金することができます。仕組みは謎です。And in English, you'd say, this is a mysterious paper known as a 領収書. If you have one of these prepared, you can get your money back later. How it works is a mystery. So 領収書, for those of you who aren't familiar, is essentially a Japanese word for receipt, but it's slightly more official and often requires a little bit of extra work on the part of the store or the proprietor of whoever's selling something, because it usually requires a stamp. And I don't really know the details of it, but I do know that, like, for example, at my local grocery store, when you go to checkout, you have to actually manually select whether you want a ryoshusho or a reshito. So they're not quite the same, but they're essentially the same, I would say, in terms of like how we would think of them in the US or abroad. There's probably other countries that have similar systems, I imagine, but the way to get them refunded, I think, would probably be mysterious, and impenetrable would be a nuzzle, would be mysterious. So yeah, actually, I realize now that I didn't define the word nuzzle at the beginning. Nuzzle is just a word that means like a mystery. And so above we said zairyo wa nazo desu. So the ingredients literally are a mystery. Here, shikumi wa nazo desu. The way it works, the system, is a mystery. And I would say that's probably true. The Japanese system of settai, which is treating people for drinks and food, I can imagine probably varies widely based on the company you're at, based on the relationship with whoever you're taking out, things like that. So these two examples are nicely bookended in this skit, and it's a pretty easy pattern that you can kind of take advantage of. And I think I recognized that immediately when I was watching this, and so started using it kind of in place of wakarimasen or something like that. The next time you're stumped, you don't know the answer, rather than just say, I don't know, you can say, that's a mystery. Although I would advise like using it in casual company. It's not something you kind of want to be joking about at work, especially if it's something that you should know the details about. And that's essentially the only language lesson I had in the newsletter this month. It was pretty short, but I wrote a bit more about why I kind of suddenly remembered this. And that reason is Katagiri Jin, who is a comedian and an actor and also apparently a ceramic artist. I found this out because I looked him up a little bit, which I did because I noticed him in this show Kichijoji Losers a few years ago, which is just a drama that was kind of middling, I would say. I've fallen off my drama kick. I have to get back into it, but there really haven't been that many shows that I've been interested in, other than there was one called Hotspot, which was pretty good, and it's also accessible on Japanese Netflix if you have that, or if you have a VPN and can access that, and might be on TVer as well. I'm not sure, but that one was good. But Kichijoji Loser is not so good, but it did feature Katagiri Jin, and it was really the first time I had seen him in a kind of main role, because he was in this sushi skit and plays one of the two kind of I don't know if they were lead characters, but two of the main characters in this skit. And he's kind of this interesting looking guy. He's like wears glasses, has long curly hair, and has a maybe kind of like slightly interesting asymmetrical face, slightly, I guess. And so he always like stood out for me. And so when I saw him in Kichijoji Losers, I was like, hey, that's that guy from that sushi skit. And I just had really no idea. I had known him from this sushi skit more so than what he's actually known for in Japan, which is as being a member of the comedy duo Ramens and being an actor and a comedian. And so I was curious, and this month decided to kind of check in and see, okay, did this viral skit from, from 2006-7 that went viral, I think probably in the internet abroad around like 2008, 2010, did it have the same reaction here in Japan? Did it have the same effect on Katagiri Jin? Do people in Japan think of Katagiri Jin as that guy like I did? Or is he something else? And I couldn't really find much in terms of the reactions, especially in Japan. There's definitely some familiarity with it, but it seems to be people who actually have the DVDs. Maybe they're Ramen's fans. But I did find a Reddit post. There's not much in terms of reactions, I think, because all the original YouTube posts have been taken down, and that's shown from this Reddit post, which I'll link in the blog this month. The Reddit post is from 14 years ago, which would have been 2011, so probably not too long after I saw it, and I think it's like representative of the impact that it had on at least the American internet, English-speaking internet at the time. If you look at the comments, it's pretty interesting. One of the comments is, my husband loves to reference this video every time we go out for sushi, especially the bit with putting your hands on the table, which is referring to the bit when they sit at the sushi counter, both Katagiri Jin and the other actor, they put their hands down immediately and then like angle them inwards so that the fingers are kind of like touching each other. In a very kind of silly way that implies that you have to be extremely like organized, right? And like when you're going out for sushi in Japan, which is not true. And the comment continues, especially the bit with putting your hands on the table and the mama ma ototo when pouring drinks. And then another commenter says, I knew this was the otototo mama mama video before even clicking it. So clearly that part has like caught a little bit of the English speaking internet's attention in 2011, which is interesting. On the other hand, I don't think that that's true in Japan. I wasn't able really to find much, but I did find a really long article, kind of like more like a long blog, writing about Katagiri Jin and really going into detail about what makes him funny and how he fits together with Ramens and his partner Kobayashi Kentaro and his overall demeanor. And the title of the article is Subete wa Katagiri Jin kara hajimatta, which means everything started from Katagiri Jin. And I'll link this in the newsletter this month. It's a really interesting article, really long article. Includes lots of links to YouTube videos, some of which are broken because they've had copyright claims filed against them. But I would recommend checking it out, even if just to see the videos, to kind of get a better sense of Katagiri Jin's like kind of repertoire, his history. But it divides it up into his konto, kind of skits, toku, and then I can't remember what the last one is. Let me see. Okay, it was neta, toku, and tarento. and give it a look. It's pretty interesting, but essentially the thesis that the writer comes away with is about Katagiri Jin is 何か考えた上で何もしない。何か考えた上で何もしない。which means Katagiri does nothing with intention is how I translated it. Does nothing with intention. 何もしない does nothing. 何か考えた上で having thought of something, he does nothing. So with intention, I kind of translated that 何か考えた上で as, and what he means by this is that in the early ramen sketches, Katagiri kind of just plays himself. He's a prop at times. He's uh, letting Kobayashi do the work and kind of playing off of him. And I think he's taking advantage of his looks here. As I mentioned, he's kind of interesting looking. He's quirky looking potentially, and kind of doing nothing. Just kind of being there is enough to get a laugh. Then the article also kind of talks about the way he carries himself as a celebrity, the way he appears on podcasts, the toku and tarento. They mention his ceramics, which is also very plain, and he kind of is always giving like the unvarnished reality of himself, which kind of contributes to this nanimo shinai kind of aspect of Katagiri Jin. The one thing I think that might work against this thesis is that Katagiri was the PC in the Japanese version of the Get a Mac ad campaign back in 2006. This was a campaign that they had in the US where I think John Hodgman was the PC. I can't remember who the Mac was, but the Mac was just a kind of regular person wearing like jeans and a shirt or something like that. And then the PC was a kind of stuffy business person that was having like getting sick because they had viruses, and then they like doing all this other slapstick stuff. And John Hodgman was very funny, I think, in that role. And they did a Japanese version of it actually, which you can still see on YouTube. I don't know how long they'll stay up there, so I included just a link to the search in my newsletter, but go check that out because Kobayashi is the PC and his partner in ramens, Kobayashi Kentaro, is the Mac, and he's this kind of, very nonchalant, normal guy, and all the slapstick and acting is being carried by Katagiri this time. But I think that ultimately the article is right, even if he's providing this, funny PC character for this set of skits. Fundamentally, Katagiri Jin is a very kind of plain comedian, is that guy, I think. And one funny kind of counter to this Get a Mac campaign is that in the article that includes a long list of a few videos that I mentioned, one of them is from the 2010 iPad launch in Japan, and it's just a news segment showing people lining up, being excited, interviewing them once they've gotten the iPad, and they're like, oh, geinoujin mo toujou shimashita, or something like that. And there's like, oh, there's even celebrities here. And the celebrity happens to be Katagiri Jin. And he's not there like in any official role. It doesn't seem like this was 2010, so it was well after the Get a Mac ad campaign. I don't think it was still going at that point. He clearly wasn't there in a paid role, I don't think, because Kobayashi Kentaro wasn't there. He's not dressed up as a PC or anything. And that kind of contributes to him just kind of like showing up and being interviewed, doing nothing. And in the interview, he's got a really funny line, which happens to use a conjunction that I wrote about back in September 2023. And that conjunction is sorega. So Katagiri buys an iPad, and the news crew asks him a question. They ask him, "Nani ga shitai desu ka? Nani ga shitai desu ka?" What do you want to do with the iPad? And his response is very funny. His response is, それが別にないんですよね。それが別にないんですよね. That's the thing. Nothing really. So more kind of like more support for this he does nothing kind of thesis. But the conjunction, check out the newsletter. I'll have a link to it in this month's this month's newsletter, so you can go back and find the one where I write about sorega. I think you can read that, but also see if you can watch this video too, because I think the tone is really important to hear, and I'm not butchering it, but I think I'm not like capturing it like 100% perfectly. So like definitely go and listen to that. I think the thing with sorega is that initially I wanted to read it and hear it as a shikashi or a tokoroga with like a hard stop after it. This kind of like conjunctions that are I can't remember what it is. I think they're adversative conjunctions or something like that, where it's essentially contrasting something. Shikashi, however, but, and those need this kind of like defined pause right after shikashi, pause, and then you continue tokoroga, pause, and then you continue with the statement. Sorega has that kind of ga sound, which is often this but, however, meaning, but it's smoother than that. And there's not really a pause after the ga in the same way. それが別にないんですよね。それが別にないんですよね. This is a conjunction where you're kind of taking some information somebody's saying, you're taking somebody's expectations. Here the expectations are, he must want to do something with the iPad. 何がしたいんですか? He wants to do he must want to do something. The assumption with this question is that there's something he wants to do. He takes that with それが別にないんですよね. And he kind of like subverts that. And someone in the comments for the newsletter when I wrote about this said that それが could be thought of as plot twist, which I think is a nice way to kind of like get a hold of it. It's maybe not quite as dramatic as plot twist, but if that's what you need to kind of like get a hold on what それが means, I think that would be a useful way to think of it. The other way to kind of think of it, I think, is that's the thing, or here's the thing. That's the thing is kind of how I translated it in the newsletter. それが別にないんですよね. That's the thing. There's nothing really, right, that I want to do. That's what he's saying here. But I think in this way, それが can be another funny phrase, and similar to nazo, in that it's not kind of over the top. It's very kind of subtle and quiet. And that makes sense with それが because you're subverting expectation. You're taking somebody's expectations and you're kind of working against them. And that can either be, I think, often disappointment with それが. Like if somebody's expecting you to have done well, you can say, それがちょっとうまくいかなかったんです. Like, you know, 試験はどうでしたか? You can say, それが合格不合格でした. それがうまくいかなかったんです. You know, the thing about that test, didn't go so well. So those aren't funny. Those would be like disappointing. But in the same way that humor is kind of like subverting expectations, disappointment also potentially subverting expectations. I think in that sense, それが is an interesting phrase to think about and potentially can be used either way. Nazo, again, another nice kind of like subtle way to provide humor that's not like over the top. And that was it. That's the newsletter for this month. I realized that there was one little note that I forgot to include last month, which was last month I wrote about itadaki instead of using itadaki instead of kudasatte when you're using thank you phrases. And of course, I forgot to use the one example that disproves my claim, which was also related to the Jimoti comment. And I think I introduced it on the blog, but I forgot to put it in the podcast, so I'll introduce it here. So I mentioned Jimoti as the recommendation, right? And the one case where I had used it, I went to pick up a used Instant Pot, and it was raining that day, and so I had to kind of like go out of the way and grab it. And I got a review from the person who sold it to me, and the review was, 雨の中取りに来てくださりありがとうございました. 雨の中取りに来てくださり Arigatou gozaimashita. So thank you for coming to pick it up in the rain. So clearly, after I've spent all last month writing and then talking about how to use itadaki instead of kudasari or kudasate, how that's more natural, somebody shows me that you can just as easily use kudasari, so it's not an ironclad rule. I guess maybe that just suggests that itadaki is the perfect level of politeness for like workplace thanks, while kudasari maybe is a heightened casual level of politeness, maybe like just slightly above kudasate. Maybe that's kind of like the only thing that really comes to mind. I mean, you're really not going to get penalized for using kudasate, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But I do think try and get your itadakis out there if you can. I do think that that's a nice polite way to thank people. Just a couple of Iro links at the bottom of the newsletter this month. The first is the Chicago Review of Books has an interview with Elena Ferrante that's very interesting. Oh, not Elena Ferrante, the Elena Ferrante translator, Ann Goldstein, who is a staff writer at the New Yorker, or staff, maybe not staff writer, but a staff member, I think copy editor. But the interview is from Ian J. Battaglia, who is based in Tokyo. And it's really a great interview. The two most interesting details for me was that Ferrante does not write in dialect, which is interesting because there's a lot of points in her Neapolitan novels where a character will say he said in dialect or she said in dialect. And so I always wondered if that was the translator kind of doing the reader a favor there and opting not to translate in dialect, but still give the not to translate in dialect so that you don't get like an Italian speaking in a Texas accent or something ridiculous like that, but still cluing them into that this is how this is being said in a different way. So that was interesting to hear. And then also it was really interesting to learn that the New Yorker paid for Italian lessons, and that's how Goldstein learned enough Italian to translate it, which is insane. Not the kind of thing you see at every workplace. Two other little things, or actually three other little things. One is that Ursula K. Le Guin had a blog for many, many years. She had a blog. It seems like it was inspired by Jose Saramago, and I guess they just went back online at some point. I guess they must have gone offline when she passed away, and then put back up online. Really interesting, and I'm slowly kind of working through those, so I'd recommend those this month. Also, if you're in Japan, I would recommend the Kirin Good Ale. This is one of these funny new beer that have been released and got not a lot of posters inside trains and things all over Japan, and the name Good Ale kind of got mocked a little bit on social media, I think probably especially because Sapporo came out with a beer also in the last couple of weeks that's called Extra Think, which is somehow an even worse beer name. But the Kirin Good Ale is actually good. I was surprised. I picked one up last weekend and am happy to say that it's a nice pale ale. Maybe potentially the best mass market pale ale ever brewed in Japan. So it's essentially a Sierra Nevada pale ale clone of sorts, maybe a little bit less hoppy and bitter. And then the other link that I have is to Matt Alt's newsletter, he's got another follow-up, this time in response to Marlon Wayans cursing Demon Slayer's success. I guess that Demon Slayer is kind of doing better than other American movies at the box office or something like that. And the most interesting line to me was this line, which Matt writes, when I asked the editor of a major manga magazine how much thought they gave to foreign consumers when planning new series, they told me none, because how would they know what foreign people wanted? And that was such an interesting line, because I feel like there are ways to know, but you just have to kind of talk to your translators. But maybe that's not important. And that's Matt actually. I posted this quote on Blue Sky, and Matt quoted my post and said this might be the key to the whole thing, and says that he's going to be writing about it more in the future. But yeah, I do feel like there's something to that in terms of the kinds of stories that get told in anime and manga. I think are interesting, and I wonder if this kind of outside intrusion from the world, this extreme high level of interest, has compromised some of that in some areas. I wonder in terms of whether there are any studios that are now struggling because they're maybe too actively trying to incorporate outside the preferences of outside readers and viewers. And now for the recommendation that I promised, Shin Osaka Station. So a couple weeks ago, I can't remember, it was probably early October, maybe late September. So that would have been, 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was a kind of warm, late summer, early fall Sunday, and I passed through the station, and it was insanely crowded. It was more crowded than I've ever seen it before. There were lines to get into both Shinkansen entrances, and I think it probably would have taken at least 15 to 30 minutes to get in through the Shinkansen gates, which is kind of unfathomable. And it did not look fun. If you hadn't given yourself enough time, you pretty easily could have missed your train. If you miss a bullet train, that's really not a fun thing to have happen, especially if you're here on a limited amount of time. So I wanted to share what I know about the station, and I think I know a secret. First, before I get into the station itself, I will say that there's really not much around Shinosaka Station. It's not really anything to write home about. But if you're living in Osaka, it is nice to kind of be within a stone's throw of Shinosaka Station. That's not always feasible, obviously. And I mean, I don't ride the Shinkansen all that often, but when I do, I can get there in about 30 minutes on one train line. And in my last apartment, it was less than that. It was probably about 15 minutes on one train line. And that is extremely nice, especially like if you're coming back from a long trip and you just want to get home, or if you have an early train you need to catch the next day. That's one thing to consider if you're ever going to live in Osaka. I wouldn't put it as the deciding factor in where you choose to live at all, but something to take into account. The other thing I think that you should take into account if you live in Osaka is the train lines out to Kyoto, because it's also nice to live on train lines that can get you out there quickly if you ever like to hop over for a visit. So that's another thing that's a kind of nice to have. Not that it would ever trump the kind of economics of a well-priced apartment or making your day-to-day commute easier, but something to kind of like take into account. And now, my biggest secret for the Shinosaka Station is don't use the Shinkansen entrances. Like, even if you're riding the Shinkansen, I wouldn't use them. Don't use them. There are two entrances that go directly to the Shinkansen gates, and they're separate from the other JR train lines. Those gates are the Central Gate and the South Gate. And the gate that I think you want to use is the East Gate, which is the gate for the regular JR trains. I don't know if you'll be able to use your Shinkansen QR code ticket to access it if you do that. But if you have a Shinkansen ticket applied to your Suica or your Ikoka, your train pass card, that will get you through the regular gates. And like absolute worst case scenario, you can always use like a cheap JR ticket, like 160 yen or whatever it is, and get that in to get through the regular gates, or just swipe your Suica card to get through. Once you're through there into the JR section of the station, first of all, it's a lot less crowded. The hallways of Shinosaka Station are pretty terrible. They're very narrow and they get crowded really quickly. And that's true like for the area between the East Gate and the South Gate. And then once you kind of pass over towards the Central Gate, it opens up a little bit, but that's the area that was insanely crowded when I went through, and I was like, this is insane. This is not worth it. So I recommend kind of going through that narrow hallway, going to the east gates, getting in, and then it just kind of opens up and you have a lot more space to breathe and kind of figure things out. And then you can also board through the transfer gate. So once you're in, you can do any number of things. Obviously, you can go on the regular JR lines, but you can also go through the Shinkansen transfer gate to get onto the train. And I have a feel like those gates will occasionally back up if there's a crowd, but I've never seen like a line for them. And I think you can imagine that most tourists are going directly to Osaka by cab. I would say many of them are not riding JR lines to get there. If they are getting there, they're getting there by the Mizosuji line or another subway line, or by cab, which means they're going to be trying to go through the Shinkansen gates. So you're going to avoid a lot of the tourists. You're only going to be dealing with the locals or the tourists who are super comfortable with the JR system, and that's going to reduce your time in line for the Shinkansen. So that's my first big tip. Use the Shinkansen, the transfer gates inside the east gates, inside the regular JR part of the Osaka station. The second reason you want to go through the east gates is because the food offerings there are much better. The Shinkansen gates have, I would say, pretty bad food. You're really just limited to your basic bentos, and even those aren't like super great unless you're a huge fan of ekiben, the bentos they sell at the stations. If you're determined to go through the Shinkansen gates, I would recommend picking up food and souvenirs at the underground shopping area near the Midosuji line, which is kind of closer to the central gates. There are a lot of options down there, including, I think, some sit-down spots. But inside the east gates, there is something they call the Eki Marché Shin Osaka, which is just a little market area. There's a lot of like high quality bento places that seem more fresh. There's I think a couple of sit down restaurants. There's a Starbucks. There's a bookstore. There's some omiyage shops. There are also some benches if you need to kind of sit down and relax. There's bathrooms, so you can kind of take your time and grab something to eat there before going through the transfer gates to the Shinkansen. There's also a bakery which has really good stuff. So yeah, I would say go in there, get some space, figure things out, give yourself some time to go in there and shop around, I would say. The other recommendation I have is just outside the east gates, there are a bunch of little kind of like, not sit down restaurants, but like to go food stands right there. One of them is the Zoji Rushi bento spot. Zoji Rushi makes some of the best rice cookers in Japan, and the rice at this place is cooked in Zoji Rushi rice cookers, and they're a little bit pricey, but not terrible. I don't think anything is over like 2,000 yen for a bento. I think the one that I've picked up there in the past were about like 1,500 to 1,600 yen or something in that price range. And then they really, it's pretty high quality, I would say. They're packing the rice separately so it doesn't get the food steamy or soggy. It's pretty nicely done. So I would recommend either that or one of the options in the Eki Marché. They seem a lot healthier, or if you're not into healthy, they've got some super unhealthy ones like fried beef cutlets, and then the healthy ones like salad bowls and things like that. So yeah, I would recommend the Eki Marché for most people, and then like Zoji Rushi for anybody who's kind of looking for something a little special or just a huge fan of Zoji Rushi or rice in general. And then I guess the other thing that I kind of have to note about Shin Osaka is the two Osaka staples that always draw a crowd. 551 Gogo Ichi is a kind of Chinese style food place that has dumplings and steamed buns. I've never seen it without a line that is like an intimidatingly long line. The only place I've ever gotten it was at Kyobashi inside one of the department stores there, when there was like, we just kind of happened to see a short line that day, and so we jumped in and grabbed it, and it's okay. I'm not sure what the fuss is, to be honest. There's a couple locations. I think there's one inside the Shinkansen gates, but There's a couple outside the Shinkansen gates. There's also one underground near the Mito-Suji line, which I think may have a place to sit down and eat. That could potentially be more interesting than getting like cooked dumplings, letting them get cold, and then eating them on the train. And then the other staple is Rikuro Ojisan cheesecake, which you see all over Osaka, but they have at Shinoosaka Station too. I think it's a bit overrated for what it is, but it's, I would say, better than Gogoichi, maybe. I don't know. I'd be curious to see if people have strong opinions about these. The closest one in Shinoosaka is near the central gates, and there's just about almost always a line, but it does move pretty quickly, and it's also, I would say, it's kind of fun. They have this really impressive system that gets the cheesecakes like in and out of the ovens at a super regular pace, so the line does move pretty quickly. They do like, I want to say like 6 or 8 cakes at a time, and they'll fill up all the cake trays with the cheesecake batter. They'll put them in, and then they bring them out, and they unpack them, and then they mark the top. They brand the top of them with this hot Rikuro Ojisan image, and our logo, I should say. And that's kind of fun. And so they're doing like 8 at a time every like 7 to 8 minutes. And so it turns over, but like you can also buy 3 cheesecakes. So it's like, it really depends on how many the people in front of you end up buying. So I think I've stood in line there twice. Once it took me around like 15 minutes. The other time it took about 30 minutes. So I'd give yourself like at least an hour if you want to guarantee you'll be able to get one and like kind of comfortably get into the Shinkansen gates, maybe buy a bento and get through there. But if you just need to kind of like get on the train, just go through the east gates, get on your train. You'll be in and out in 5 minutes. I wouldn't get to Shinoosaka Station too long before, because you're worried about like not being able to get through the gates and make the train. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But if you're looking to take your time to pick up omiyage and stuff, especially Gogoichi or Rikuro Oji-san cheesecake, like give yourself a lot of time. The one item inside the Shinkansen gate that's interesting and worth trying to pick up are toncho. These are like sticky rice with soybeans and kombu that have been like shaped into triangles. They're super tasty, and I think they only sell them inside the Shinkansen gates at some of the kiosks. Sometimes they're sold out. When they have them, you don't usually have to wait in line for them. There's 2 different types, if I remember correctly. They make a perfectly good meal if you pair it with something. It's just rice, so it's not really a full meal in and of itself. But if you could buy like some kind of sozai, like a la carte katsu, or I guess if push came to shove, you could do like a fami chicken from Family Mart and pair it with that. That might be a nice little like Osaka snack. And then you can also find the karu, which I guess it's both curl and carl. It doubles for both of those. They're essentially just cheese puffs, and they have 2 flavors, cheese and dashi. And the reason why it's both is because curl and carl is that the mascot is this kind of bearded man, I think, named Carl. That's what I always assumed. But yeah, they sell these cheese puffs in cheese and dashi flavors. They're only sold in Kansai, so you can't pick them up in Tokyo. So if you're looking for kind of a unique little omiyage for somebody in Tokyo or elsewhere in the eastern part of Japan, pick up a couple bags of those. You'll be able to find those inside Shinoosaka Station as well. And that's all I've got. Hope you all are doing well. Thanks. This was a long episode. I hope if you made it this far, thanks so much for listening. And once again, get off Spotify. I'll be shifting away from that. You can always reach me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. Let me know if you have any questions or need recommendations. I'm glad to provide more info. And till then, we'll see you next month.